Morning.
In fact, there's not room for us to go.
Good morning. My name is Andrea Hoffman, and I am a member of the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Trees. I'm pleased to welcome you to this special meeting. I'm going to call this meeting to order, call the roll, and then introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Doug Tallamy. This event is being live streamed. Okay. It is now 10 o'clock. This meeting is called to order. Present are Elise Burns, Dick Byrne, Sturgis Dodge, Susan Gay, and Joan Flaherty. Let the record show that Tony Sharp, Terry Eskew, Bunky Marquette, and Kate Downs are absent. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Doug Tallamy, professor and chair of the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He is the author of many research papers, as well as several books, including the gardening community favorite, Bringing Nature Home: How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens. His research has focused on the ways that insects interact with plants and trees to support diverse animal communities and create thriving habitats. Here in Rehoboth Beach, each of our individual yards are part of a greater landscape. What we choose to plant in our own yards can be both pleasing and environmentally sound. So to teach us why and how to be better stewards of our environment, please welcome Professor Tallamy.
Thank you, Andrea. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Just to set the record straight, I am not chair anymore. That's an old bio, I think. You're looking at a caterpillar up there, and I've heard a rumor. I don't really believe it. It could be fake news. But I've heard a rumor that some people don't like caterpillars. But come on. How could you not like that beautiful caterpillar? Yeah. All right, that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I change my titles all the time, but what we really need to do is put our ecosystems back together again so that they function on their own. We've developed landscapes without that in mind, which means they're not doing so well right now. And one of the themes of today's talk is going to be that you don't have functioning ecosystems unless you have healthy insect populations, which is counter to what a lot of gardeners have been pursuing. So we're going to talk about why that is and what we can do to help those insects along. But before we do that, I want to talk about my grandchildren. It's always time to talk about the grandchildren. They live in Portland, Oregon. And Portland, of course, is known as one of the greenest cities. They claim they're the greenest city in the country, and maybe they are. They're very environmentally minded, a lot of LEED certified buildings, and everybody rides their bike, and they've got a big urban park, forest park, water conscious. They're doing a lot of things right in Portland. But when we go to Portland to visit the grandchildren, one of the things I notice is that the trees in Portland are not from Portland. They're not from the Pacific Northwest. There's certainly the favorites from Asia, and we have a lot of these right here as well. Calorie-pairing ginkgo and zelkova, a lot of trees, a lot of species from Europe. They really like their Norway maple and their little leaf linden, horse chestnut, and they even have a lot of species from the East Coast. So native to the East Coast, but not to Portland. That's sycamore, red oak, sweet gums are our favorites, but they've got a lot of trees. Very few are from Portland, or at least that's the way it seemed to me. And year after year, I said, boy, I got to measure this. I'm going to see what the percentage of native trees versus non-native trees is in Portland, Oregon. And when my oldest granddaughter got to be 8 years old, I decided that was old enough, and I gave her a clipboard, and we started to walk around Portland. And her job was to write down what I called out, and then my job was to decipher what she wrote down. But we did. We looked at a lot of trees. We looked at 1,176 trees in Portland. 100 were indigenous to the Pacific Northwest, and 1,076 were not. So that's 91.5% of the trees in our greenest city are non-native. So if I wanted to design a city that was unable to support birds or bees or butterflies, that's exactly what I would do. I would load them with plants from China or Europe or someplace else. Now, they do have some birds in Portland. They've got scrub jays, and they've got crows. And they have them because those birds have learned to live off of human garbage. And there's enough of that around. They have robins, because robins can reproduce off the worms that are in the lawns. But there are a whole bunch of birds that want to breed in Portland but don't. And how do I know they want to? They're right outside of Portland. Uh-oh. We just seem too long. There we go. Okay. During the wintertime, people put up bird feeders, and many of them come in to Portland. So it's not that they're afraid of the city or anything. They're just nothing for them to eat when they're breeding. And that includes things like the spotted towhee and white-breasted and red-breasted nuthatch, fox sparrow, black-headed grosbeak, several woodpeckers, downy woodpecker, hairy, pileated woodpecker, Lewis's woodpecker, red-breasted sapsucker, the ruby-crowned and golden-crowned kinglet, western bluebird, varied thrush, western tanager, black-throated gray warbler, brown creepers, bush tits, black-capped and chestnut-backed chickadees, Buick's wrens, juncos. All of these birds could be breeding in Portland if there was enough food to support their breeding, but they are not. So our greenest city is a biological desert. So we have to do two things. We either have to change the definition of what green is, or we have to change the way we landscape our cities. Now, our kids live there, and they say, "Oh, Doug's dumping on Portland again." There's nothing special about Portland. I could go to almost any city in the entire country and get the exact same results. It's not because these places are cities, it's because the plants we put in these cities are not native and not able to support the animals that want to live there. So we have two choices when we build landscapes. We can build landscapes that support the natural world around us, or we can build landscapes that are ecologically dead. Those are our choices. If we choose the first option, we can sustain the human enterprise. And if we choose the second option, we won't, because we humans need nature. It's not optional. All right, so we're going to talk about how we put nature back into all the places where we haven't thought about that. But to do that, we have to understand what nature is, and it is a series of very specialized relationships. There are some generalized relationships out there, but by and large, most of the relationships between plants and animals in nature are highly specialized. So for example, if you want these two beautiful moths in your yard, that's the goldenrod stowaway. Misnomer, because it has nothing to do with goldenrod. You need that, and that's what its beautiful caterpillar looks like, by the way. You need Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. That is the only plant that larva will eat. If you want to have acorn weevils, you got to have acorns. And you're not going to have acorns unless you have oak trees. If you want pileated woodpeckers, you have to have trees large enough to house carpenter ant colonies, because that's what they feed their young, carpenter ants. You won't have 13 species of native bees unless you have sunflowers, because they will only rear their young in the pollen from sunflowers. A lot of specialization among our native bees. And you won't have phlox divaricata unless you have the insects that pollinate phlox. It does spread readily from seed, but only if it's pollinated. And if you look at the entrance to that corolla, it's extremely narrow. Tiny little hole. I've watched native bees land on these flowers and try to get their mouth parts in there, and they can't do it. So who's pollinating our phlox? Well, it turns out it is day-flying sphinx moths. Things like the hummingbird sphinx or the snowberry clearwing. They have really long tongues, and they sink them deep into the corolla of those flowers, and when they pull them out, they're covered with pollen. Then they fly to the next flower, and that's how you get your phlox pollinated. So you can get your phlox pollinated if you have adult snowberry clearwings, but you can't have adult snowberry clearwings unless you have larval snowberry clearwings, and you won't have larval snowberry clearwings unless you have coral honeysuckle, the native honeysuckle, because that is the plant that supports that larval development. So specialized relationships in nature that involve insects are the rule. They are not the exception. Of course, they always start with plants. There are a lot of animals that depend on the specialized relationships that insects have developed with plants, and I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee we have around here. If you go farther north, you got the black-capped chickadee. They look almost the same, doing very similar things. So we'll just talk about chickadees. People think of chickadees as seed eaters because they are one of the most common birds we have at our feeders all winter long, eating seeds. But when it comes time to reproduce, to make more chickadees, their babies can't eat seeds. And that is true for most of the birds that are out there. They don't eat seeds, they don't eat berries. They eat insects. So the chickadees have to switch to insects, and when they are in a healthy environment, they will feed their babies almost exclusively on caterpillars. Caterpillars are special, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes. And they're not exceptions. Again, most birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. All right, let's talk about now. Why caterpillars? A number of reasons. First of all, most caterpillars are soft. So think of this guy as if he's a sausage with a very thin wrapper. Now, the thin wrapper is cuticle, it's exoskeleton. It's not digestible. The birds don't want a lot of exoskeleton. So you got a thin wrapper stuffed with lots of good food in there. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your baby without fear of injuring it. And if you watch a parent bird feed their young, they're pretty rough. It's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They are nutritious. They're very high in fats, very high in protein, and they have a low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles. So beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. And most of the beetle is exoskeleton that's not digestible, and they don't make that good a food source. And finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mentioned carotenoids because they are essential components of our diet. Only plants make them. And without carotenoids, we don't exist. So we need to get carotenoids from plants. And it's the caterpillars that are delivering them better than any other insect. We have a lot of data to support that if you're interested later on. Point is that for most birds, caterpillars are not optional sources of food. They are essential sources of food, or at least that's what all the data is suggesting. And that means that if you are a bird and you're trying to breed, you're not going to be able to do it if you're in a land that doesn't have enough caterpillars. So that is the next question. How many caterpillars is enough? How many caterpillars does it take to make a clutch of chickadees? And the answer is a lot. It takes a lot of caterpillars. And it was these birds that taught me that. Years ago, I didn't know what chickadees were rearing their young on, so I wanted to take some pictures of what they brought to the nest. So I put a chickadee box up in my yard, and I hung it low so I could set my camera up and take pictures of what they were bringing in. And that's when I learned they were bringing in caterpillars, but I also learned they're bringing them in very quickly. With both the male and the female out there foraging all the time, they can bring a caterpillar to the nest once every 3 minutes. I watched them for 27 minutes once, and they brought in 30 caterpillars during that 27 minutes. How do they do that? By bringing in more than one at a time. Sometimes a whole bunch. They're doing this, they're working very hard from about 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., back and forth, bringing in caterpillars to the nest. Okay, the next question is, how many species of caterpillars do they bring back? And this turns out to be a really important question. First of all, chickadees and most birds do not forage very far from the nest. They don't want to spend more energy looking for food than they get from the food itself. So it's about 50 meters from the nest. That's where they're doing their foraging, which means if you want breeding birds in your yard, you need what they need within 50 meters of the nest. Well, I watched them for 3 hours at one point, and during that 3 hours, they brought back 17 species of caterpillars that they had found within 50 meters of the nest in my yard. Why is that important? That's important because if I had 1 or 2 species of caterpillars, and it happened to be a bad year for those particular species, because all populations fluctuate, there wouldn't be nearly enough caterpillars for the chickadees to reproduce. But if I have 17 species or 34 species or 134 species, and at that point I decided you better count the number of species of caterpillars you have in your yard. And I'm just talking about moths now. They almost never bring back a butterfly caterpillar. I've got 936 species of caterpillars in my yard that I have counted so far. And I'm in my 3rd year, so every time I go out, I get new species. Well, there will always be some combination of all of those species, so that in combination, there'll be enough caterpillars so the chickadees get to breed every year. And that's the important point here, is that when you have a diversity of food, you have stabilized the food web. It doesn't matter what the weather is. There's always enough food in my yard for the chickadees to reproduce because I've got so many plants that make so many species of moths. Well, there was a guy, Richard Brewer, way back in 1961, was studying Carolina chickadees, and I don't know what his primary question was, but one of the things he needed to know was how many caterpillars do they bring back to the nest every day. So he counted a whole bunch of chickadee nests, and it was between 390 and 570 caterpillars per day. And they're in the nest for 16 days. Then they fledge, and the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 24 days. But they're flying all around, so old Brewer couldn't count them. So just at the point where they fledge, that's 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars required to make one clutch of chickadees. And if you want those chickadees in your yard, you need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. Again, not the goal of typical gardens of the past. And chickadees are tiny birds, third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. What if I wanted to have a red-bellied woodpecker in my yard? They're 8 times heavier than a chickadee. How many caterpillars does that take? And I don't want just chickadees and red-bellied woodpeckers. I want a whole diversity of birds. I'm biologically very selfish. I want scarlet tanagers and titmice and blue jays and bluebirds and tree swallows and common yellowthroats and indigo bunnings and towhees and yellow warblers and wood thrushes and house wrens and cardinals and hummingbirds. And I don't want one pair. I want breeding populations so they can sustain themselves. If not in my yard, then in my neighborhood. How many caterpillars does that take? A lot. You might think, well, the hummingbird, Mrs. Hummingbird here doesn't need any insects because she eats sugar water. And she does. She's eating sugar water from the impatiens there. But you don't make a bird out of sugar water. So 80 to 90% of a hummingbird's diet is insects and spiders, and then she goes to get the sugar water. And that is true for 96% of the birds in North America, the terrestrial birds. Those are bird families that are rearing their young directly or indirectly on insect protein. And when I say indirectly, I mean if they ate a spider, the spider ate an insect to become a spider. So it's all about insect protein. And this is news to a lot of people. Again, most people think birds want seeds and berries, and we put up our feeders, and a lot of birds take advantage of that. But think about all our migrating birds. They're migrating because they don't eat seeds and berries. They eat insects, and they have to go south to get those insects. So bottom line is no caterpillars, no baby birds. A bit of a generalization, but not much. And that means we have to create landscapes that are capable of producing the abundance and diversity of insects that we're talking about here. How do we do that? We have to go back to those specialized relationships to do that. We have to, and I'm not talking about pollinators right now. I'm talking about things like this polyphemus moth caterpillar and the oak leaf that it's eating. The most abundant type of specialized relationship all over the planet is the relationship between insect herbivores and the plants that they're eating. Highly specialized relationships. Because plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they have loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And if you don't believe me, when you go outside, find a leaf and eat it. See if you like it. You're not gonna like it. There's a reason we can't get our kids to eat vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat those plants. They are too well protected chemically. But we do know that insects eat leaves. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, that's where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are what we call host plant specialists. They pick 1 or 2 plant lineages that share a common cocktail of chemical defenses, and then they develop the adaptations necessary to get around them. They develop the physiological mechanisms, the enzymes that can store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of evolutionary history for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. Let's use the monarch butterfly as an example. Most of you already know at least half of the story of monarch specialization. You probably know it's a specialist on milkweeds. That's why we're all planting milkweeds to try to save the monarch. And you may know that milkweeds are toxic plants. When you're out eating a plant, don't eat a milkweed. They've got cardiac glycosides in them. And if you eat enough of that milkweed, it'll stop your heart. That's what cardiac glycosides do. It does not stop the heart of the monarch. And they do have a heart, by the way, because they've got the enzymes that detoxify cardiac glycosides. But what about the sticky latex sap? They give milkweeds its common name. This is something most people don't think about. When you break open a milkweed leaf, though, all this white goo comes out. If you get it on your finger, you usually wipe it off right away. But if you don't, let it sit there for a minute or so, it starts to gel, turns into a chewing gum-like substance. And that's its defensive property. If a caterpillar gets that smeared on its mouth parts, it glues its mouth shut, and then it starves to death. Well, there's a caterpillar that eats milkweeds. How does it eat milkweed leaf without gluing its mouth part shut? That, of course, is the monarch caterpillar. And you can watch this in your yard. If you have milkweeds, the first thing they do is they walk onto the leaf, and they typically go to the end of the leaf, and they start to eat. And if any latex sap starts to come out at all, you see a little bit of white coming out there. It'll stop eating immediately, turn around, go back up the leaf, maybe 2/3 of the way, and then it starts to chew through the midrib. And it chews till it has completely severed that midrib. And what it's done is cut off the flow of latex sap from the top part of the leaf to the bottom part of the leaf. And then it can turn around and go back down, and it can eat that leaf without any latex sap coming out at all. It's a very simple behavioral adaptation, but it's one most insects have not figured out how to do. That, by the way, flags the leaf. So if you are a monarch hunter, you can drive down the road, look at a milkweed patch, and if you've got flag leaves, you know there are monarchs there. Okay, those are the upsides of specializing for monarchs. By focusing all their adaptive abilities on this one genus of plant, they've been able to use a plant that most other insects can't use. It's too toxic, it's too well defended. The downside of specialization is that now that's all they can eat. So by focusing on that one genus of plant, it hasn't spent any time trying to get around the tannins that are in oak leaves, or the cucurbitaceans in cucurbits, or the nicotine in tobacco, or the cyanide in cherry. Every single plant lineage out there is defending itself, and monarchs can only eat one. One genus out of 2,137 native plant genera in North America. That's host plant specialization. And I want to emphasize that there is nothing special about monarch specialization. That's what 90% of our insects are doing. And it works well as long as you have the plant that they specialized on around. But we have not been very nice to milkweeds over the years. We've never shared our residential neighborhoods very well with milkweeds. We haven't thought about it, but they were doing okay in agriculture until we decided we're going to change our agricultural ethic and not allow any weeds on the sides of the fields. So as of 2013, there were only 3.6% of the monarchs left east of the Rockies. West of the Rockies, the Pacific population of monarchs is doing even worse. They've lost 99.9% of the monarchs now because we've taken the milkweeds away. So if you want monarchs, you have to put the milkweeds back. And of course, we do. You know why we want monarchs? Why? They're pretty. They don't carry diseases. They're pretty. If they were an ugly moth, we wouldn't care. But most of the 90% of the insect specialists, for the ones that are driving food webs, are brown moths that people don't care about. So we have to start caring about their host plants too. All right, we're talking about food webs that are driven by insects. That gives us the ability to rebuild food webs wherever we want to, if we understand what the components are. And I want to give you an example. We're going to rebuild the food web of the white-eyed vireo. And I'm going to use the white-eyed vireo because that's the nest that my wife Cindy found in our yard a few years ago. Now, to do that, I have to take pictures of the caterpillars that the birds are bringing back to the babies. And if I can identify the caterpillar, we know a lot about what caterpillars eat. Then we'll know the plant that is necessary to make the food for the baby vireos, and that's the plant we put in our yard. So let's do that for a little bit. That caterpillar is the blinded sphinx moth. It's a specialist on black cherry. We have a lot of black cherry in our yard, making blinded sphinx moths so the babies get to eat. This guy is the chestnut schizura, a specialist on native viburnums. In our yard, that's Viburnum dentatum, and I know that because I planted it. Our yard was mowed for hay before we moved in, so most of the plants that are there are ones that we have put in ourselves. And now it's making. That's okay. It gets us to focus on chestnut schizuras made by the arrowwood viburnum, and the babies get to eat again. This caterpillar with the white stripe is the drab prominent, specialist on sycamore. Now, we did not plant sycamore in our yard, but about 2 years after we moved in, there was a big wind, blew in some sycamore seeds from someplace, must have been a bomb cyclone. And one landed in my cold frame, and it germinated, and I'm not very fast at weeding things out. It's now, I think this year, it's top 70 feet tall. But it's making drab prominent. I don't have a cold frame anymore, but I've got drab prominence, and the babies get to eat again. So on and on we go. This is the 8-spotted forester moth, specialist on native grapes. This is the lunate zale, another specialist on black cherry. This is the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. If you look closely there and that's prothorax, you can see the phony eye that's supposed to scare the bird into thinking it's a tree snake. It didn't work this time. That's a specialist on spicebush and its close relative sassafras. We have both of those. This is the tufted bird dropping moth, another specialist on black cherry. So black cherry is emerging as an important component of this bird's food web. But these guys are hungry. They need a lot more than that. So let's put some black walnut in the landscape. If we do that, we get the walnut sphinx, the gray-edged boma loca, the black blotch caesura, the bride. These are all specialists on black walnut in my yard. Native maples give us Plagodes inchworms, the green striped mapleworm, the maple bantam dagger moth, and of course many other species are on these plants. Same with native elms. This is the American elm. Give us the four-horned sphinx, double-tooth prominent. It's a double-tooth prominent. Interrupted dagger moth, and of course many others. Remember, 90% of the insects that eat plants are not going to, 90% of the insects that the babies need to develop are not going to be within 50 meters of that nest unless you have the plants that make those insects. So if you want the mustard sallow, you need witch hazel. If you want the hackberry emperor, you need hackberry. If you want Cuculio asteroides, you need native asters. The Arcigera flower moth and brown hooded owlet need goldenrod. Hog sphinx, Pandora sphinx, abbot sphinx all need Virginia creeper. Redbud leaf roller needs redbud. The gray furcula needs native willows. Turbulent phosphilla needs greenbrier. And the orange tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, pleasant dagger moth, lesser oak dagger moth, greater oak dagger moth, the street dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher. And many, many more won't be there unless you have oaks, because oaks happen to be the best caterpillar producers, which means they're making more bird food than any other type of tree, and not just here, not just at my house, but in 84% of the counties of North America. And this makes it easy. You can go almost anywhere and plant an oak and know that you are helping food webs more than any other type of tree. You know where I planted? You know where I took all those pictures? Yeah. I did take them in my yard, but I took them in my front yard. Because usually people say, we're going to build backyard habitat. As if everything I'm talking about is so ugly, we have to hide it in the backyard. We do not have to hide it in the backyard. Put your oak tree in the front yard. It'll be okay. It also cuts our conservation options in half. Why is a dead front yard okay? I don't get that. And why do we want all these insects? The birds need them. We like birds, and yes, we want them for that. But if you look carefully at food webs, insects are critical components of almost every single terrestrial food web. All spiders, for example, eat insects, or they eat other spiders that ate insects. And I know a lot of people don't like spiders, but look who does. It's the second most important component of bird food webs after caterpillars. And plus, they're really valuable predators. I mean, instead of hiring Mosquito Joe, don't kill your spiders. Insect herbivores are the food for insect predators. So if we got rid of our insect herbivores, we would lose the predators, and they themselves are important components of food webs, so we don't want to lose them. If we lost our insects, we would lose our frogs, we would lose our toads, we'd lose all the amphibians because they all eat insects. So do our lizards, so do our bats, so do our rodents, because insects are really good food. Pound for pound, some studies have found twice as much protein in insect meat as there is in beef. And they have organs in their abdomen called fat bodies, which are loaded with lipids, high energy compounds that allow these little guys to grow quickly, reproduce quickly, And if you're a mouse, that's what you want to do, because there's a lot of things that want to eat you. Same reason that larger organisms are eating insects. The skunk is digging up your yard to get the grubs because they are really good food. Possums eat a lot of insects. Raccoons eat a lot of insects. Even things we don't think of as insectivores eat a lot of insects, like our friend the red fox here. 25% of its diet is insects. 23% of a black bear's diet is insects. Almost a quarter of these predators' diets are insects. So it doesn't matter how big you are, you need insects. And even if you don't eat insects, you need insects. This is a sharp-shinned hawk. It's a bird predator. And you might think, well, I can get rid of all the insects in my neighborhood, and I'll still have sharp-shinned hawks. But if you get rid of all the insects in your neighborhood, you won't have the birds that he eats. So he needs them indirectly. Same with the garter snake. He's not eating insects directly, but he's eating the frogs and toads that ate the insects. The point is that a world without insects is a world without biological diversity. And Edward O. Wilson, told us decades ago that a world without biological diversity is a world without humans. How does that work? Well, there he is. He's a great man. He just turned 90 this year, professor emeritus, the only scientist to ever win 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And one of his goals, one of his many goals of his career, has been to save life on Earth. It's a big goal. One of the first things he did in 1987 was to write a paper called The Little Things That Run the World. And the goal of that paper was to convince us that we cannot live without insects. If insects were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants. And if most of the flowering plants disappeared, it would drastically change energy flow through our ecosystems. In other words, it would collapse the food webs that support our animals, our birds, our reptiles, our amphibians, and our mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because the rapid decomposition achieved by insect decomposers would be gone. And of course, humans would not survive those changes. Well, this was 1987, and nobody was thinking about losing our insects. As a matter of fact, we've spent a lot more time thinking about how to kill them, and we're very good at killing them. So not only did we ignore EO's warnings, but we kept killing them. And then we get headlines like this. Insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, they didn't read EO. He told us what it means for the rest of life. It's not good. This actually is good news, though. The New York Times carried articles about insect declines globally 3 times in 2018. And that is good news because there's no way we can address a problem if we don't recognize that it's here. Insects have been declining for decades, but now we're just recognizing it. And of course, we humans, we're not proactive. We just react. Well, we got to react to this now because this is serious. That wasn't the only headline. This one came this year. UN report says, not only are we going to lose insects, we're going to lose 1 million species. And humans will suffer. Okay, they're catching on. By the way, this is not a viable option. Losing 1 million species or the things that run our ecosystems is not an option. And that's what I object to these reports. They report them as if it's inevitable, as if it's not going to matter, and that there's nothing we can do about it. All of those things are incorrect. We can't tolerate it. There are things we can do about it, and it's not inevitable. And then what happens to the things that eat those insects? Well, this is the third blockbuster headline. We now have 3 billion fewer breeding birds today than we had 45 years ago. 432 species of North American birds now at risk of extinction. That's more than a third of our birds gone or at risk of extinction. Let me remind you what a billion is. 1 million seconds is equal to 12 days. 1 billion seconds is equal to 31.7 years. A lot of birds that aren't here anymore. And the problem with these statistics is it's called shifting baseline. So 45 years, nobody in this room is older than 45, which means you don't remember a time when there were 3 billion more breeding birds here, which means when you go outside and it's quiet, you think it's normal. It's all you've ever known. None of us remember, or none of us missed the passenger pigeon because it was long gone before we were born. It was the most numerous bird on the planet, 4 to 5 billion of them. Gone. And that means we don't react. So we can't let shifting baseline fool us. These are real issues. They're happening. We have to react to them. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the only viable option I see is that if we humans are going to persist on planet Earth, we have to learn how to live in ecological harmony with it. We have to learn how to live sustainably with the natural world that sustains us. Because if we don't sustain it, we won't be sustained. People always overuse that word, but just unsustainable is not an option. So the only way that we can live in ecological harmony with the natural world is to restore the insects that run it. So let's talk about that. What are the causes of insect decline? Well, there's a number of them. Overuse and misuse of pesticides. I am not saying there's no role for pesticides out there, but misusing them and overusing them is not what they're designed for. Habitat loss, sure, habitat loss is certainly there. Non-native ornamental plants, so plants from someplace else, to which our insects have not been able to adapt because they haven't been here long enough, is a serious issue. It's a serious issue because those are the plants we put in our yards, and we think, well, it's just our yard. But when you add up all of our yards and our other human-manipulated ecosystems or area, it's 602 million acres in the US, which is bigger than, what, 37 states? Not combined, but individually. It's a huge amount of area where we've taken plants from Asia and brought them over here as decorations. Then many of them escape and become invasive species. 86% of the woody invasive plants in North America are escapees from our gardens. So using these plants that don't support insects because they don't have the specialized relationships is a major cause of insect declines that very few people are talking about. Security lights, climate change. There's good news here too, though. Look, let's take climate change away, because that's a big one. But the top top 5 causes there are things we can turn around almost immediately. So I'm a professor, I make assignments. I'm going to give you all an assignment. I want you to act on those 5 things. I won't assign climate change yet, but turn it around, at least at your house. There's no reason why we can't increase insect loads at our houses if we address those factors. Let's focus a little bit more on non-native plants because they destroy bird food. They don't destroy it, they don't make it. Right? It is not made when your landscape is filled with non-native plants. And now our natural areas are filled with over 3,300 species of plants that we call invasive species. By the way, the definition of an invasive species is a non-native plant. You cannot have an invasive native. I hear that all the time. You can have an aggressive native. It's a non-native plant that's excluding native plant communities that used to run our ecosystems. And that's why it's an issue, because these plants are not ecologically equivalent to each other. And when we allow non-natives to invade our natural areas, this is what it looks like. That's White Clay Creek State Park, the park I drive by on the way to work when I go to the University of Delaware. I took that picture in March, and every bit of green you see there is an invasive species from Asia. Because plants from Asia, for some reason, leaf out before plants from North America. It's a very convenient time to look at your natural areas and see what the invasive plant load is. So what are these plants? They're all plants we brought over purposely. Multiflora rose, oriental bittersweet, Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, privet, miscanthus, ailanthus, calorie pear, porcelain berry, huge one now, autumn olive, and all the ones I'm forgetting, you know what they are. A third of the vegetation in our natural areas are plants from Asia that are not supporting our insects. How do I know that? Well, that's what we measure in my lab. We've been doing that for 12 years. We've got a lot of data telling you what happens when you take away native plant communities and replace them with plants from someplace else. And I'm just going to share one quick, very simple experiment with you to show you how devastating this can be to the food webs that run our ecosystems. What we did was go into hedgerows in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania that were invaded with non-native plants. So there you see a lot of autumn olive and all the other guys I mentioned, and compare the caterpillar communities in those hedgerows with hedgerows that were not invaded. They were almost entirely native plants. And what we found was that the number of species of caterpillars in the invaded hedgerows was reduced 68%. The abundance of those caterpillars was reduced 91%. And the biomass of caterpillars, the energy flowing through that food web, was reduced 96%. So just to simplify it, we reduced the bird food by 96%. What if I said to you, introduced plants have reduced your bank account by 96%? You would immediately get it, that that is not tolerable. Well, insects are the currency in our ecological bank accounts. And they are every bit as important in keeping us alive. It's our ecological bank account that keeps us alive. We cannot tolerate these losses, not for very long. So it's not the presence of introduced plants that is destroying ecosystems. It's the absence of native plants. And if the introduced plant becomes invasive, it causes the native plants to disappear. But here's a typical home, suburban landscape. None of those plants in the front are invasive, but none of them are native. So they're not destroying the food web, they're just not making any of it. We gotta put the native plants back into these situations. So let's take a house like this. Does anybody live there? Is that their house? I took that from a helicopter, and I don't know who lives there. But it's typical. I mean, it's typical. It was not designed to support insects or ecosystem function, because we've always had this idea that humans are here and nature is someplace else, and nature's happy someplace else. Well, that's someplace else now. There is no happy nature someplace else. So we have to make landscapes like this more functional. So I talk about the future of conservation being on private land, or at least land that is managed by townships, by we humans. It's not going to be in our natural parks and preserves because they are too few and too small and too isolated to support the biodiversity we need these days. So the future of conservation is going to be on the land that we own and the land that we manipulated. 85.6% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. That's where it's going to happen, or it's not going to happen. Which means when we go we have to change the way we think about what our landscapes are doing. When we go to the nursery in the past, we've always looked for plants that are pretty, because we've had this idea that plants are just decorations. They are decorations, and we can continue to decorate with them. But when you only pick a plant based on its aesthetics, you're not considering the ecological role that those plants could need to start playing at home. And when we landscape with the idea that plants are just decorations, then landscaping equals ecological destruction. So that's a beautiful landscape, but it's not a functional ecosystem. And if you do that everywhere, then you don't have functioning ecosystems. What we need to do is raise the bar about what we've asked our landscapes to do. In the past, we do ask them to be pretty, but now they also have to support life. They have to support those food webs we just talked about. They've got to do all the important ecological roles that plants do. They've got to sequester carbon, because we put way too much in the atmosphere. A third of the carbon that is up there right now, by the way, has come from us chopping down the forests and getting rid of the plants on planet Earth. All that carbon is up in the atmosphere now. So if we put those plants back, or at least a lot of them, we could pull a lot of that carbon out. And what happens to it? They pump it into the soil. The soil scientists are now telling us that soil can sequester 7 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. I had a student a couple of years ago who said, we need to invent a machine that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, fixes it, and pumps it into the soil. I said, yeah, except we already have that machine. It's called a tree. But you have to put the tree there, and you have to leave it there, and it has to be a long-lived tree. So we're going to enrich our soil with carbon. All these plants we're putting back on our properties are managing our watersheds. Everybody lives in a watershed, everybody. And nobody has the ethical right to destroy that watershed. I know nobody sets out to do that, but that's the way that's what's happening when we don't think about what the plants in our landscapes are doing. And we have to support our pollinators. And if I asked you why we need to support our pollinators, you would probably tell me because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. It's actually about 1/7 of our crops, but forget our crops. That's a really anthropocentric view of why we need pollinators. They pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. I don't care if the other 10% are all crops. It is not an option. We're not talking about good land stewardship here. We're talking about essential land stewardship. And we're approaching another election now, and I always look at the top 10 things people are worried about. Losing ecosystem function is not one of them. Well, maybe some year. So what we need to do is we need to pick plants that are pretty, but also deliver ecosystem services that support our food webs, that protect our watersheds, that store carbon, that have balanced communities of natural enemies, that control our herbivores, that have diverse communities of pollinators. You know, I'm not talking about the honeybee, folks. I'm talking about the 4,000 species of native bees that did all the pollination in North America before we brought the honeybee over. All of those things have to start happening wherever we are, And when we pick plants based on at least partially on ecosystem function, then landscaping equals ecological restoration. And I'm going to call this 21st century landscaping. We have done 20th century landscaping for the last 100 years, and now we're in the 6th great extinction. So I would say it's not working real well. Let's give this a try and see if we can turn that around. All right, which plants should we be sure to have in our landscapes? Well, we've been thinking about this for a long time. We like to make lists in my lab, and we have now made lists that rank plants in terms of their ability to make those insects that drive the food webs for every county in the whole country. And one of the big patterns that jumped out at us once we had all of these lists is that it's really just a few of the plants around us making most of the food. About 5% of our native plants are making about 75% of the food that drives those food webs. So I started calling those plants Keystone species, Keystone plants. Remember the Roman arch, the keystone's in the middle? If you take the keystone out, the arch falls down. Well, if you take these plants out of your food web, the food web collapses. So what I'm saying here is not all native plants are equal in supporting food webs. Some are much better than the others. We're not even talking about non-native plants here now. So the question is not, are natives better than non-natives? In general, they certainly are. It's really, do we want ecologically productive plants in our landscapes, or do we want destructive plants or unproductive plants? I think it's a no-brainer. We just have to start thinking about that. So here's an example. Here's ginkgo biloba. I get emails pretty regularly from people saying, don't you know that ginkgo grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes it a native. That means I can plant it. Yes, I do know that ginkgo grew here 7 million years ago. But you know what? I don't care if they grew on the moon 7 million years ago. Ginkgos support 0 caterpillars. So it's a tree that doesn't support food webs at all. So if you load your landscape with ginkgos, it's kind of like a statue. It's sitting there. It can be pretty, but it's not supporting the life around you. And if that's our goal, then we have to add this as a criterion. And compare that to the oaks in the mid-Atlantic states. 557 species of bird food supported by oaks. And I'm not talking about the acorns. I'm just talking about the caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic. All right. Number 2, and most of the counties of North America are native prunus, so things like black cherry and pin cherry, American plum, 456 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic on native prunus. Let's compare that to zelkova, another favorite street tree we brought in from Asia, and I guess we brought it in because it looks like the American elms we lost to Dutch elm disease. Zero caterpillars on zelkova. That's what it always looks like. It's always perfect, and if that is your goal, to have a plant that interacts with nothing, then zelkova is for you. But if your goal is to support life around you, then zelkova is not for you. Yes?
Okay, I grew up in bought a house in a development, and they're all over the place.
Yeah.
Now, what do I do? Cut them down?
We'll talk about that. I know. Yeah, we're going to have to transition. First of all, they don't live that long. So when they die out of attrition, replace them with a productive plant. They're also becoming invasive. I look behind my mother-in-law's retirement community. The street is lined with zelkovas, and now so is the woods filled with them. So it's not on any invasive list, but there it is. Pieris japonica used to be the most common foundation plant in North America, but this illustrates that important point. We have native Pieris, but it is not a very productive genus. Only 2 species of caterpillars use it. It could be a native blueberry where you have 249 species using it, or a native viburnum, 108 species using it. English ivy supports nothing, crepe myrtle support nothing. So these are the results of the choices of the plants that we put in our yards. So where do you find out what the keystone species are? You go to this website, National Wildlife Federation website, look up Native Plant Finder and put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody and the ranked list of herbaceous plants will pop up in terms of their ability to support food webs. So this used to be a major issue. People say, I don't know what to plant. Now you do know what to plant. It's not a mystery anymore. So I'm trying to get you to think of the plants you put in your landscape as if they are bird feeders, because they are. There you go, they're bird feeders. Now you get to decide how well you're going to feed the birds. You can feed them a lot, or you can feed them just a little bit. This is what a lot of the landscapes around me look like. Giant lawns with almost no plants at all. You could put food in your bird feeders. Put the species that make a lot of bird food in your yard, or you can keep them empty. That big tree in the back there is the ginkgo, but it's empty. And if we don't landscape with this Keystone plant idea in mind, we are not fooling the birds. Here's a little bit of data from my recent PhD student, Desiree Narango, who is now doing a postdoc in Massachusetts. She studied chickadee reproductive success in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. So, these birds want to breed with us. Chickadee reproductive success in relation to the plants in the landscape where they were breeding. And she could control that by putting up nest boxes. Chickadees are cavity nesters, and there's never enough cavities in suburbia. So you put up a nest box, they will come and try to use it. You're looking at one territory. The star is where the nest is. The red line is the foraging territory. So they did 95% of their foraging within that red line. And the blue areas are the trees on which they did that foraging. And those are the plants they did, and they're all the native trees in that area. Basswood sweet gum, American elm, black cherry, and 2 species of oaks. But these are the trees they did not forage on, and they're all the trees from Asia. Japanese maple and silk tree, our friend the ginkgo, black poplar, saucer magnolia, crepe myrtles. How do chickadees know that those plants are from Asia? They don't know, but they do go into the ginkgo once looking for food, and they go back as often as you would go back to ShopRite if the shelves were bare. It's called optimal foraging. They cannot spend time looking for food where there is none, so they learn very quickly which trees are the best. So Desiree was able to take landscapes that were predominantly native and compare chickadee reproductive success with landscapes that were predominantly non-native. And when they were predominantly non-native, they produced 75% less bird food, fewer caterpillars. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So the nest box is up there. The chickadees came, looked around, and said, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try. The nests, if they did try, they contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive at all. They produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do it. And when the chicks left the nest, they were lighter, so they had less of a probability of surviving. And you might say, well, those aren't huge differences, but when you put all that together in a population growth model, this is what you get. So let's walk through here. The bottom line is the percentage of non-native plants in the landscape, and we're talking about by biomass, from 0 to 100%. This dotted line up there that says replacement, that's the rate at which the population has to reproduce in order to replace the adults that are lost every year. And if they reproduce at that rate, that is a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking. Anything above that line is a growing population, and anything below it is a shrinking population. And where the blue overlaps the replacement dotted line there is about 30% non-native plants. So when you have 30% or fewer non-native plants in your landscape, you can have a sustainable chickadee population. But when you have more than 30% non-native plants, you have a declining population, an unsustainable population. So this is actually good news for 2 reasons. First of all, this is the first time this has been measured for any bird anywhere. So all the people who doubted whether the plants they choose for their yard actually impact living things around them, this will tell you, yes, it absolutely does. The other good news is that it suggests there's some room for compromise. I looked up compromise in the dictionary the other day, and it's not there anymore. This study can help put it back. If you have less than 30% non-native, you can have your crepe myrtle as long as you've got your oak or something else to balance out, and then you can have sustainable breeding bird populations. She also looked at the migrating birds that passed through her study plots within the Beltway in DC. 51 species of migrants stop there during the day. Migrants fly at night, by the way, and they'll fly all night long. And what they do is they use all their energy. They exhaust themselves. And when they come down during the day, everybody says they're resting. But what they're really doing is eating. They're gassing up so they can continue their migration. And if they come down in the land of ginkgo, they can't gas up. That's the end of the migration. So you might say, I don't have a property big enough to support breeding birds, and that might be true. But if you have a property big enough to support one tree and you make it the right tree, you can support migrating birds, and they will use it, particularly here on the coast. You know, the whole coastal migration follows the coast very closely. You guys are in a very powerful position to help migrating birds, both in the spring and the fall. A guy by the name of Roy Dennis in England, he's a land manager in England, recently said that land ownership is more than a privilege, it is a responsibility. And I could not agree with that more. That is our beautiful planet Earth. And what you're looking at is the biosphere. It is that thin film of life that surrounds planet Earth. And if planet Earth were an egg, the biosphere would be thinner than the eggshell. And as far as we know, all the life, well, certainly all the life we're ever going to interact with is right there. And maybe all the complex life in the entire universe is right there in the biosphere. But we've chopped it up into private land ownership. You know, Tom owns this, Dick owns this, Harry owns this, Mary owns this. Okay, but Roy Dennis is reminding us along that land ownership comes the responsibility of stewarding all the life in the universe. I can't think of a more awesome responsibility than that. I passed by this church in Mississippi, and everybody's inside worshiping God's creations, and on the outside, they're killing them all. Because we're not thinking. So that doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you certainly can save it where you live, and we need to start thinking about that. I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. If we're only focused on our property, that shrinks the problem to something that is a lot more manageable. But it also means you are now a very important component of the giant conservation jigsaw puzzle. You're one of those pieces. And if enough people don't play the game, we got holes in conservation. So we need everybody to play the game. So as property owners, each one of us certainly has the power, and we have the responsibility to fix this. None of us are going to be able to fix it alone, but we certainly can fix it together. Thank you very much.
Doug Tallamy has offered to take questions. What we would ask is, would you walk up to the microphone and speak into it? Just give your name and where you live. Thanks.
You just eliminated all the questions.
Hi, Charlie Garlow here in Rehoboth Beach. Are there communities that have taken your wisdom to heart and developed the program or developed, I hate to say it, regulations to encourage or mandate this sort of protection for our Earth?
Yes, the answer is yes. And I wish I was better at remembering all the people that come up and tell me about success stories. I think it's Wisconsin that is now paying people to get rid of lawns. The Reston, Virginia, years ago, passed a rule that all public plantings governed by Reston are going to be native. And I hear this all over the place. So, I've been talking about this for about 12 years now. And I can tell you change is happening. We are slowly changing the culture, and actually a lot faster than I ever thought we would. So yes, it is happening.
Marta Namek, I was wondering if there are screens, trees that you recommend that can be used to screen a busy road that also sustain birds and insects.
Yeah. Most people use conifers to screen. But we in the mid-Atlantic states have what we call the conifer conundrum. We don't have that many native conifer here, but one good one that grows quickly and is an excellent screen is eastern red cedar. There are 40 cultivars of eastern red cedar, and if it came from China, everybody would plant it immediately because it'd be high status. But because it's a common weed around here, people ignore it. But you plant it pretty densely, it's a wonderful screen, and it makes a lot of berries. you know, the cedar waxwing, it's named for eating the cedar berries, and it supports a lot of insects as well. So.
Hi, Doug. My name's Leanne Augustine. I live in Lewis, right on Route 24. Bought a beautiful house. They have beautiful blue atlas cedar trees, ornamental cherries, crepe myrtles, and I get a lot of pushback from my neighbors when I'm cutting down healthy trees. So how do I start? How do I start integrating native trees into the yard?
Well, that would be the first thing I do is not start by cutting something down, but by adding something. Changing culture is hard, and you take a beautiful blue atlas cedar and say, "Well, I'm gonna cut this down." That, you know, I appreciate the issue. Maybe you get lucky and it'll die. So that's the easiest thing, is just by attrition. When something dies, replace it with something better. But the crepe myrtle is kind of a no-brainer. We got a lot of crepe myrtles. They can live without it. Yeah. You know. But so I you know, it's hard. I don't have a magic bullet for you. But you know, you're thinking the right way, and you'll find a way.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Sue Claire Harper. I live in unincorporated Rehoboth. 2 questions. I note that the reference you gave for determining what native species are, you give your zip code. What happens if I get a native from in Georgia or Virginia or one of the other places? Does that diminish the value? That's one question. And the other part of that, if I have a native, like I have a couple of Itea Little Henry, a dwarf form of the Itea, does that diminish the value?
Okay, so that's the cultivar question and the what is a true native question. You know, I'm trying to reestablish food web connections so other animals can be supported, and food webs are awfully quite large. So for example, if I am an insect and I eat beech, American beech, beech goes from northern Florida to Canada. So if somebody gave me, let's say I live in New Jersey and somebody gave me a beech from Florida, I wouldn't know the difference. I would eat it, it would be just fine. But if we plant a beech from Florida in my yard in Oxford, Pennsylvania, it will die the first year because it can't handle the cold. So the plant provenance is more important in terms of keeping that ecosystem going than meeting the needs of the insects, which will eat. You know, they're much more widespread than people think. It does not. So for example, if the tree is not from your county, will an insect still eat it? Of course they will. Yeah.
And the dwarf aspect.
And the dwarf, yeah, the cultivars. That's the most common question I get. A cultivar is a genetic variant of a straight species, and probably most of the cultivars are natural variants that were found in nature. All right, so somebody found a short Itea and said, hey, let's put a name on it. Itea, by the way, is one of those natives that supports, I think, 1 species of caterpillar, but it's an excellent pollinator plant. So you're trying to meet the needs of different groups of insects. So Itea is a wonderful addition to your pollinator garden. And I recognize the need for putting plants in small places, and a lot of our natives are you know, tall or gangly, and so what we did a study looking at 6 traits, and plant habit was one of them. We did not look at flower traits. It was changing a green leaf to red or purple, disease resistance, habit, enhanced fall coloration, and enhanced fruit size. I think that's 6. And the only genetic change that decreased insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because that's introducing anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. And unfortunately, those are really popular cultivars. Everybody wants their red leaf, red bud, and their red leaf this and red leaf that. That's just a fad. The green ones work really well. But most cultivars are focused on flowers. And Annie White at University of Vermont is working on that. And she's getting more differences than we got, because when you fool with a flower, you're changing the energy budget. Flowers are there to help the plant reproduce, and they have a given amount of nectar and a given amount of pollen. And if you make the petals twice as big, you're taking the energy from somewhere, and there's probably less nectar. We're just starting to look at changing the nutrient content of pollen. There are a lot of bee specialists out there, and if you fool with the thing they have specialized on, they're probably not going to be able to use it. So she is, her data suggests you really want to stick with the straight species for pollinators, with some exceptions. There's a phlox that, what is it, Phlox paniculata, is it? Where it produces twice as many flowers. And that's a natural variant somebody found, and then they put a name on it. Well, twice as many butterflies go to it, so it can go either way. The thing I have against cultivars is that most of them are propagated clonally, which means we are putting zero genetic variability out there. And in these days of extreme, challenges from our weather, we need all the genetic variability we can get. So I would love to see nurseries carry straight species along. They can have their cultivars and let the marketplace work it out. But if you want to buy a straight species, you ought to be able to do it.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Dr. Tallamy, thank you for coming today and presenting this
You're
very
welcome.
important and topical and current information to us. My first of two questions, if the moderator will allow me, by the way, Al Hoffman of Rehoboth. When are you coming back and giving your lecture on nature photography? Pictures are incredible.
A real photographer would laugh at you for saying that. So
I'm not a real photographer.
Okay,
and
well, I could
you're
give it to-
99% better than
digital
than
makes
most.
it pretty easy. Digital. Like this shot, they happened to nest in a blueberry bush right outside my garage window. So all I had to do was sit in the garage and lift the window up and sit there and take their picture. So
I could sit in my garage for decades and never get a shot like that.
raise
Anyway.
the window slowly.
Yeah, I need to get rid of that motor that runs it, so it would scare them off. The real question, 4 words, bats, good or bad?
Bats? Oh, they're good. They're good. Again, I have to talk about Mosquito Joe. And I know you guys live on the coast, and the salt marshes make a lot of mosquitoes, and I get that. But who eats a lot of mosquitoes? Our bats do. And part of the problem is we brought over white-nose disease from Europe and killed most of our bats in the Northeast here. There is some evidence that there's some resistance, and those colonies are going to survive and slowly increase, and that'll be great news because losing the bats is a terrible hit on the natural controls that keep things in balance. I don't know why we don't like bats because of the Dracula movies. I don't know, but they occasionally get rabies, but so do dogs and raccoons and everything else. Believe me, your cell phone is going to kill you a lot faster than your local bat. So we want to encourage them every chance we get.
Yeah, I was just concerned about the competition for food with the birds.
They're eating different food. First of all, they're foraging at night. The birds are not foraging at night. The bats are picking off night-flying moths, and most of those moths are not flying during the day. So the birds are going after their caterpillars, but insects have a tremendous ability to reproduce. And what keeps them, the reason they're declining is we've made that very hard for them, but when we make it easy for them, they make a lot of insects, and then you need things to control them. So you need those insect predators, you need the bats, you need all those things that are eating insects.
Okay, thank you very much.
Liz Null from Dewey Beach. Once again, thank you for coming. I just wanted to put in a few plugs for some efforts that are happening here in Delaware. At the state level, there is the Delaware Native Plant Commission, which is a commission commissioned, I guess, by the governor, where we are studying, trying to get legislation passed to not sell invasives and studying native plants. There is the Delaware Invasive Species Council, which has its annual meeting next week, where they're studying invasive species in Delaware and what can be done. And then finally, there's the Flora of Delaware, done by Bill McAvoy, who I'm sure you know, which is a huge database. It can be kind of overwhelming, but it's searchable. You can search by wildlife. You can search by plants for the coastal plain, which is what we should be thinking about down here. You can search for plants native to Sussex County. It is a wonderful resource. It's a state resource done by the state botanist of Delaware. I happen to work at a garden center where we specialize in native plants, but anyway, that's not why I'm here. But anyway, there are efforts happening here in Delaware specific to us. The phlox that you mentioned, Phlox Jenna, was developed at Mount Cuba, where they're doing a lot of research on native plants. They specialize in native plants. And I just say from our own observation, our Phlox Jenna at the garden center was crawling with swallowtail caterpillars. They just loved it. But they're doing a lot of research at Mount Cuba on flowers and native plants and which native plants attract more flowers and the flower structure. But you know more about that than I do. So thank you.
My name is Jan Conacy, and I live in Rehoboth in the city. And we also have a house in Dover on the lake, on Moores Lake, full of oak trees, poplars, massive, big things. What has shocked me in Rehoboth is we, many, many years ago, at least 15 years ago, passed a tree ordinance that we thought was a good tree ordinance. And but lately, people have been cutting down old growth trees. Last week, 2 oak trees bigger than I can put my arms around were cut down in the setbacks of a property. And the rumor is, because the people threatened to sue, the city let them cut them down. So obviously our tree ordinance isn't working. We encouraged people for a long time to plant Bradford pears tree. Now we encourage them to take them down. So what can communities do to encourage? I mean, even in Kent County, if we chose to cut down all our oaks and poplars and beech and everything, I mean, these massive trees we have, we could do it. There's nothing to prevent us from doing it. There should be. You know, how do we make a tree ordinance? What communities have made tree ordinances that stand up in court so that a city doesn't cave the minute somebody says we'll sue? And then my second question is, how do we build, because we've asked for years for a tree plan for the city, which we still don't have. How do we build a tree plan for our city? Are they being done? Is there a state help, like a state forester, that would help the city build a tree plan? And are there model legislation? I mean, you know, a builder says, well, we have to cut down the tree because it's you know, we might damage the roots. But I've seen model legislation all over the country where they even require hand digging. And we don't do that. Our lots are 50 by 100. Some where these 2 oaks were cut down were double that size, but most are 50 by 100, which means that you have not a lot of space to put trees, but they can be. Our yard is covered with trees, not trees you would be happy with probably, but some are. But anyway, those are my questions. How do we do that?
Okay, yeah. Well, they're good questions, and those are things we're going to be dealing with in the future. Part of this cultural change is to get people to realize that they own that piece of planet Earth, but everything they do on that piece affects everybody else. So taking down those 2 oaks on their private property impacts the watershed, it impacts carbon sequestration, it impacts the greater good in ways that we're just starting to appreciate. If we change the tax structure to encourage responsible land ownership, it would change overnight. And it wouldn't have to be huge benefits, but it would give cultural permission to actually doing these things that we value. So are we close to that? I don't know. No, you know, we have to have enough people who think these are valuable things. And that's why I go all over the place and I talk to people like you because you guys vote. Can I give you everything you just asked for? No, I'm not a political guy. I probably should be, but there's only 24 hours a day, and you've got all you people. You know what to do. You know, find the political will to do this. Get a town council who's not going to cave. I mean,
That's a goal.
yeah,
That's a goal.
yeah. You know, I don't know.
One of the things that we notice here, and I was on the Planning Commission for a number of years, is that everybody wants their neighbors to not cut down their trees and to abide by the code.
Yeah.
but they want to do what they want to
do the
do on
king.
their God's little 50 by 100 lot. So
We do
that's
have,
what we find.
there are things like iTree now, which can actually put a monetary value on trees of different sizes of different species. You can say, oh, you want to cut down your oak? Okay, you owe us $3,500 because that's the value of that tree over the next 5 years. That would discourage some things. It would discourage the little old lady who cuts down the oak because she's tired of raking the leaves. So you got to have a really good reason these days.
Doesn't discourage somebody who's building a $5 million property.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
thank you so much.
All right.
Bob Schneffy, and I live in Rehoboth. And you knew what one of my questions is. I have a 4-foot diameter oak tree.
Right.
About how old is it? It's a red oak, I think.
4-foot diameter, you know, it's measured in hundreds of years. Measured in hundreds of years. Red oaks grow pretty quickly. So if it was more than 200 years old, I'd be surprised, but I'd put it at, you know, over 150 anyway.
Based on what she was saying, Rehoboth's law, if you cut down all the trees on your lot and build a new house, you're required to plant 3 3-inch diameter trees. I think that's it.
Right.
Most of the people are planting crepe myrtles.
Yeah, well, these are simple rules to change. I mean, those rules were established in the 70s. They're outdated, they have no ecological basis, and they have to be changed. I hear this all the time. My city or my HOA says, I can't do this. Infiltrate these places, change the rules. These are crazy rules that are indefensible in our current ecological climate. So that's the solution, is change those rules.
I think they're working on new tree rules, but I haven't seen them yet. The other thing is, every day I feed my squirrels and birds with a big thing of bird seed and broken bread. I've seen probably 7 squirrels at one time eating this seed. Every now and then in South Rehoboth, someplace, there are white squirrels, and they're not albinos. Can you explain anything about that? And I've got pictures of them.
If you had
and
said
I've
they
seen
were
3
black
at one,
squirrels.
3 at one time.
Well, an albino has red eyes, but you can have white that is not albino. It's just called leucistic, and that's what it sounds like to me. You've got a genetic variant. In the old days, those would be picked off very quickly by predators, but you don't have enough predators where you are, so we've got leucistic deer hanging around. But so I would, feeding your birds are great. I would leave out the bread because that's not great for them. It expands in their gut, and it's not what they need.
Okay, but I'd still, if you find out anything about these white squirrels, then I can show you pictures of them.
Okay.
And they're not
I've got a picture of a
albinos.
white robin. Yeah, it's unusual, but
Yes.
Talk afterwards, I can give you some. I can give you some information, we can talk afterwards.
I think they're mostly around Laurel Street. A friend of mine lives there.
They're all over, I've seen them in the DC area.
Right. Okay, thank you.
hey, thanks.
Hello, Renu Gupta, and I'm from Lewis, moved here recently from Connecticut. I have one question actually. What is a good tree that promotes privacy and drainage? Because here drainage is a big issue.
Right.
So
I missed the
okay.
second word. A good what tree?
Drainage?
Just a good tree that gives you privacy and drainage.
Yes.
By privacy, you mean a complete screen in the wintertime?
Well, some screen.
Yeah, yeah. Something that doesn't drop its leaves. And first of all, I talk about oaks all the time, but there's a condition in oaks, particularly young ones, called marcescence, where they hold their leaves all the way to April. And the white oak group is really good at doing that. There are also oaks that are not huge. Blackjack oak, dwarf chinkapin oak, dwarf chestnut oak. They'll make acorns at 5 feet tall, and they hold their leaves. So they give you more screening than most people think. and all oaks are not 300 feet tall. So, but again, I go back to the eastern red cedar, which is a really good screen. It grows quickly, and if it gets too big, chop it down and plant another one. But and you can easily make a hedge of them. The other thing is that everybody think hedges have to be the same species. Make a diverse hedge of several different species. And if you have the room, make it more than one plant deep, and that provides screening, even if it's just bare branches.
How about the drainage issues?
The drainage is a function of the soil. So if are you talking about trees where you have poor drainage and they're sitting in water?
Yeah, they might be.
Okay. There are a lot of plants that like that. The Ilex verticillata, the winterberry, holds its bright red berries all winter long, very attractive. That can be in standing water. Buttonbush can be in standing water. Clethra can be very, very dense. And none of those are very big. They'd be good for yards. Clethra, sweet pepper bush, good plant around here.
I just have one question. My name is Cynthia Campbell. I'm from Lewis, from a development right outside of Lewis, built on a farm field like so many of them. This past year and this past spring, our community put together a community project. I wrote a grant along with a lot of help from my husband, and then we had teams of people. We wrote a grant to the Urban Forestry Division of the Delaware Department of Agriculture. It's a $5,000 matching grant, so we put up $10,000 to buy native trees and shrubs. We did 19 different species of native trees, and most of the things you've mentioned we've planted, like spice bush, pepper bush. The whole community got involved, and you had to do it. Towns can do it. They can be tree towns, which Lewis is, and I assume Rehoboth is. But HOAs can do it as well on common property. So that was the first thing, to convince the HOA we need to do this on common property. Then, to get them to front the money, and then we'll get reimbursed $5,000. So take a look. The grant period started last year, November 1st. So good timing to look up urban forestry on the web and see what they're doing this year. My big question is about spiders. I know I have so many friends and relatives that go on spider patrol, kill them, kill them, kill them. And I think a lot of people spray, and I understand why, because our back porch has all kinds of stains, and we power wash a couple of times a summer, and within a week they're all back, but we don't spray. Is there any way to get spiders to go someplace else? I don't want to kill them, but to get them off my porch, or some plants that I could plant out, because I think my neighbors would stop spraying if they could find a way to.
A sign. Spiders with an arrow. One of the reasons spiders go to back porches and everything is probably you have lights on at night.
No.
No? Well, that's one reason anyway.
A light in the house, yeah, okay.
Or they're coming to the light in the house. Spiders tend to go where the insects go. That's what they're after. And spiders are just looking for structure to build their webs against. And your house gives lots of nice structure for that. But if you were to go out in the woods, there's spiders out there too. But it's probably the lights around your house. That was one of the lists thing I had on there, security lights. Put motion sensors on your security lights so that they only turn on when the bad man comes. If they're on, all night long, you're bringing in a zillion moths. Yeah, well, it'll turn on, right? Yeah. And you save a lot that way.
We have a neighbor 2 houses down that
Yeah.
keeps security lights.
The real solution, though, is to get over the fear of spiders.
Well, I'm not afraid of them.
No,
I
but
just pick them up and take them outside.
But if your neighbors are spraying, they must think something terrible is going to happen, and it's
But they
not.
make a mess of the porch. Okay, never mind.
I think two more. Okay.
Hi,
Yes.
my name is Catherine Burgwin, and I actually live on the west side of Route 1 near the wastewater treatment facility. And I had the benefit of having FEMA tell me that my flood insurance was going to increase 25% for 5 years because of Sandy coming through, because I am in a floodplain. So anyway, long story short, I borrowed the money and I lifted the house, but destroyed the yard. And in the process, I've been trying, because native plants have been, if I were a young woman, I'd go back to school and study this, because I find it fascinating. I lived in Marin County when they ran out of water and everybody was freaking out with all their non-natives. So my question to you is, it's taken me a little bit of time to find native plant dealers. But when I go to big nursery places, they don't really understand or know. And if they do, the cultivars, that was a question. I loved that, and I had that same question, is a cultivar okay? And I wonder, is it more expensive? I always feel, I had an ex-husband that says it's always about money. Always think about money. Is it more expensive to try to cultivate native plants than it is regular plants? Or is it just a function that more people are familiar with the non-natives and you can sell those for less?
Well, at this point, it's the economy of scale. They have scaled up the production of easily grown non-natives for really a century, and they're very good at that. Could you do that with natives? Of course.
Of course.
But it hasn't been done yet. So they're small growers here and there, and it's just an economy of scale. A plant is a plant. Plants from China don't grow better than plants from here, even though everybody says they do. So bottom line is, no, it's not more expensive when you
not more
get into
difficult.
the production line. Yeah. And yes, people are familiar with it. And remember, if they just think it's a decoration, they go looking for something pretty. They don't know what the plant is, and they don't care. That's red. I like that. I'll get it.
Right.
So it's education.
Okay, and then one other quick question. So in my learning process, I know coastal versus Piedmont. Is that what the other one is? In Delaware, do I have to always be coastal?
Well, there are plants that are both. So I talked about black cherry being really important in oaks. They grow in the coastal plain and the Piedmont. Coastal plain, particularly where you are, you've got to think about salt tolerance, because you get, and Piedmont never has salt issues.
Right, lots of water, yeah.
So there are a lot of plants that grow in both places. There's some plants that really favor coastal plain, like sweet gum does really well in the sandy soils.
Okay. So I don't.
But it's
really,
not as hard and fast as you might think.
But it probably would not behoove me to plant a Piedmont that doesn't grow in the coastal plain.
Well, no. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're in charge.
No, okay. Oh. This is it, okay? You've done great.
Okay.
I'm Sumner Crosby. I'm from Lewis, and I'd like to see Lewis engage in the same conversation that you all have initiated. Thank you for having the meeting, and thank you, Dr. Tallamy, for coming and speaking. I hope there'll be some way to access some of these fabulous slides and all the numbers. I don't know, maybe there's a way to do that.
I can give you
My question sort of builds on some of what she was saying, but I'll put it a little differently. We have, lots of us may live in houses in developments that were all done, with the kinds of houses that you've shown surrounded by grass. Some of it may be a matter of what plant material is available at the nurseries, but I would argue a lot of it has to do with what designer is involved in specifying what trees go where. My wife is involved in an effort in Lewis along a series of byways to help replace the crepe myrtles and so on with more appropriate native alternatives. Is there a database? Is there some way that a landscape professional could crosswalk their sort of form function needs with your native habitat? Where do we find it?
There's a lot of information out
Okay.
Yeah. So first of all, they can go to that native plant finder and get that type of information. But there's also a guy whose name I always forget, who's creating a database for exactly that. The plant function calculator or something, where a designer can go in and say, I want this, and it will give you a rating for the landscape you've just designed. No. No, yeah, but this is a brand new thing he's working on, and he'd be upset if I forgot. He knew I forgot his name. Okay, last question.
Okay, thank you for talking with us today. I had a question about native hollies. I see a lot of them in the coastal areas like Cape Henlopen State Park. What function do they have in the native landscape? Do they support pollinators or caterpillars? Or
Okay, I'm glad you asked. So in terms of making caterpillars, very low. Not many things eat hollies, but they are wonderful pollinator plants. They have little teeny flowers that you don't even notice, but you look at those flowers when they're in bloom, and they are loaded with the tiny native bees. They support lots and lots of native bees. It's also a wonderful plant for the coastal plain because it's salt tolerant. Then they make those red berries that sustain the wintering birds throughout the mostly at the end of the winter. But it's a very important piece of the plant community in coastal plains. So all for them. Okay,
Dr.
that's
Tallamy,
it.
thank you so very much for being here. To adjourn this meeting, I just have one public service announcement. The Mayor's Advisory Committee on Trees is offering a workshop this Wednesday. It'll begin at 1 o'clock. It is Pruning 101. And if anyone is interested, we are going to this is going to be a hands-on workshop. We ask you to come dressed and with your own equipment. We are going to begin by pruning around City Hall, and we will then move to Central Park. So if you are interested, could you come up and just let me know? Again, thank you all for coming.